Correct. So this wrist, the light's not great either, but this wrist used to look like I was wearing a watch when I wasn't wearing a watch. But now it's gotten like, I think if the light was a little better, I might be able to show it to you. But you have to really strain to see, oh yeah, I see there's a little pink
You're
spot there or
saying that
something.
based on your eating, your vitiligo is reducing?
Yes, yes.
Hi, thanks for being here. Good to see you. I'm glad you're back to my show, Growth Factor. I'm Amalia, and next to me is Sameer Dosani. Now, why is he here today? Well, you watch a lot of shows on all kinds of topics, veganism, carnivore, and all other kinds of things on the internet. But what's different about Sameer is he's actually lived it. He's not just talking about books he's read or data statistics. He has been all over the world. So he lives his passion. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. He's a health and nutrition coach. He's right now looking at you from Johannesburg, South Africa. However, he's lived in Canada, the Philippines, India, because he worked in the NGO sector, which is non-governmental organizations. He's worked on social and environmental and economic justice. So he really lives the life that most of us just talk about or read about. So Sameer, can you give us a little bit more about your background and how you help people?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I came to this, as an activist, as a young activist at the age of 18 or 19, I sort of became quite a militant sort of, yeah, just an activist. I was into feminism, animal rights, a number of other things, veganism. And, when it came time to look for a job, I tried to find something, that would really be something that I was passionate about. And what I was passionate about was social justice. So I got a chance to work on global economic justice issues. And the attitude I took was, I may have some expertise, like I had a university degree or a couple of university degrees or whatever, but I'm not the expert. Because the people who are living this life, the people who are actually, working the farms, they already have all the expertise they need to thrive. It's just that there are circumstances, there are material conditions that have put these folks in poverty, right? So my job was to help them uncover solutions that would work for them. And also, I mean, you can't leave the government out of this when we're talking about sort of big scale stuff, right? So the idea was start a small project based on, for example, women's right to food or women's right to grow food or to control land. And then, eventually you show that to the government and you scale it up, right? So that was the beginning. Right away, as we discussed earlier, the whole vegan thing turned out to be a bit of a red herring that really wasn't helping anyone. So ideologically, I left that a long time before I stopped being vegetarian myself, which was only about 6, 7 years ago now. Anyway, so that's what, and then I stopped being vegetarian because of my own health issues. And I discovered when I started trying to fix my own health issues, I discovered that everything I'd been taught about nutrition was wrong. And then I fixed that, and then I got a little bit angry. Like I'm a very passionate person. Like when I feel that there's injustice in the world, I feel like I got to do something about it. And so at the time, it was like the world had conspired to show me a lot of problems. So one of my best friends had cancer that he later died from. I had a lot of just illness around me. My father later would develop a very rare autoimmune disease. And so I wanted to really become an expert in this, not just for myself, but for those in my community to help people. So now that's what I do. I am a health and nutrition coach, as you say. I'm still accepting clients. I take people on a year-long journey to really improve their health and, 100% success rate so far. So it's been great. It's been really great to actually, what I miss sometimes, when you're in management or when you're talking to governments about policy and so on, what I miss is sort of getting your hands dirty and really getting sort of deep into it and helping people improve their lives like on a day-by-day basis. And that's what I'm able to do now. So I'm really happy with that.
I'm just so happy that you're here, Sameer. He's just such an impressive human being. He's written a book. I'd like you to talk about that in a moment. And everything you need to know, I'm going to put in the description as well as comments. And Sameer can also put some more information about him in the comments as well. So if you're interested in contacting Sameer, that's how you can do it. And the reason I call my show Growth Factors, there's so many ways to grow. Some of you might be struggling mentally with anxiety, doom, or even bipolar depression. Some of you are having gut issues, Crohn's, IBS, IBD, which is for me, all very similar. Or skin issues, eczema, psoriasis. Some people just got a cancer diagnosis. So you'll notice on my show, if you click below, and I really hope you subscribe, and we'll talk about Sameer's show as well, subscribe and hit the alert button and share. Most importantly, if you could share Sameer and other of the interviews. For example, I have Dr. Dannenberg, who saved his own life from cancer, and Guy Tenenbaum, same thing. He looked all over the world to see the best treatment. So these are people given 2 to 3 months to live from cancer, and they're still 2 to 5 years down the road and have a clean bill of health. So I want to ask you, Sameer, can you tell us some interesting stories, because they're about farming or the people you've met and why you've chosen one way of eating over the other? Because I have vegan friends who say, I am plant-based, I am vegan, and that's the best way to eat. Can you explain to us, maybe through anecdotal or even data, and what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is that those who are trying to live an exclusively plant-based lifestyle, first off, hats off to you. I think it is possible to do, at least for a short period of time. And I'm not really here to tell you what you're doing is right or wrong, but I will tell you that you are experimenting. You are trying something that has never actually been done in human history. When we look at every culture, and by the way, the same to some extent can be said of carnivores. I think it's a bit different, but there's no indigenous culture on the planet that is purely vegan. When we last spoke, Amalia, we talked about India, and I mentioned you were asking whether there are vegans in India. The answer is yeah, they're vegans now because they've been influenced by sort of Western vegetarianism and so on. But traditionally, Indian vegetarians are dairy-based. That's just the culture. My own family, part of my own family comes from an upper caste Hindu, mostly vegetarian background. So I'll tell you, what we eat in the traditional house is a lot of dairy products. So it's just not the case that there has been a vegan culture. So if you're trying to do that, good luck to you. And you're going to have to look at things like supplements. You're going to have to look at B12 supplements. You're going to have to look at certain kinds of protein supplements, because in my experience working with people, most vegan diets are deficient in certain amino acids. So you need certain kinds of proteins. So that's sort of the tips. In terms of what I've seen in the field, I've seen a lot of things. I've seen people living on a lot of different kinds of diets. I've seen people eating insects as part of a traditional diet, for example. And I've seen people eating, mostly plant foods as well. Yeah, and I think they all can be healthy. I mean, I think what made a lot of the communities that I've seen in the field, the communities that I've worked with, I can recall this one conversation I had on the riverbank in India near the Narmada River Valley with someone who himself was a vegetarian, but he had gone out that morning and goes out every morning and catches fish, right? Because that's his livelihood. And you think about that and you think, okay, these guys are basically eating once a day. If they are vegetarian, they're eating a very dairy-based meal. And they just don't have time to, the particular people I'm talking about weren't really the poorest of the poor. They were doing okay. But life is so busy, they didn't have time to eat more than once a day. And sometimes they would be fast, so they wouldn't even eat that. So I think this idea of feast and famine that you see in many traditional societies, where they go many days without really having much to eat at all. And then some days there will be a feast day. There will be days when they eat more than what they need to sort of for their metabolism, right? So that idea of feast and famine, I think when we look at all the societies, I think that's really what stands out, that there's that balance. Some days you're really hardly eating, and other days you may fast altogether. But then you balance that out with days where you're going to eat. And on traditionally in feast days, even vegetarians in India, and I get into this with one of the food historians on my channel, even vegetarians in India on feast days would have some meat, which I thought was really interesting to learn too.
Could you tell us about your channel, your book, and then we're going to get more into vegan versus carnivore, why people maybe should be vegan, doesn't sound like it, or eat more meat. Can you tell us more about you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the channel really has two kinds of videos. So one, it has sort of shorter videos that are just responses to things that I want to talk about. There's a whole series about my pet peeves. So I have a whole series about how cholesterol is kind of a pet peeve of mine, or this phrase fruits and vegetables is a pet peeve. So those are sort of shorter videos between like 5 and 20 minutes. That's just me talking to camera. And then there's interviews. So there's a series, the podcast is called Recovery and Transformation. So I try to talk to people who have lived their own transformation, who have gone through a transformation in their own life, or who I think could help my listeners transform their own lives. And just to understand, I think where I'm coming from that may be different from other people is that for me, everything is really political. And so our personal decisions are also shaped by our political realities. And so some of the interviews on there are really about how the politics has forced us into certain choices that don't serve us, or forced us into certain addictions that don't serve us, and how you can't always change the political realities, at least not immediately, but you should at least be aware of them so that you know what pressures are pushing you in which direction, so you know how to push back. Um, in terms of the book is called The Health Dialectic. It came out about a year ago. It's a short handbook. I think some people have read it in 20 or 30 minutes. And I think it's just a good guide to sort of give you this background of how society is pushing us in a certain direction towards all the processed foods. I use the donut as like the anti-food, like a donut. If you think of what food isn't, it's not a donut, right? That the highly processed carbohydrates and fats. I use the label of Krispy Kreme really as like everything that you need to avoid is in there, right? So that's what it is. I hope it's of use to people. I think the ebook is $3 to buy a hard copy. In the US is $5. It's available on Amazon. And if anyone wants a free copy, they can write to me and I'll send them one too.
I want to ask you about your family in a moment. I have my notes here about my own family and some things I've taught my kids. So I taught my kids because they have pressure, as we do in society now, to be vegan, or now they're trying to remarket it as plant-based because they feel like vegan sounds too extreme, but it's the same word. And I've said to them, try vegan. If your skin is fine, if your gut is fine, if you're going to the bathroom fine, if your joints and your mind are healthy, then try veganism. But for me, I tell my kids, I tried veganism, then vegetarianism. Why did I do that? Because I read Diet for New America by John Robbins, the heir to the Baskin Robbins empire, because he said he had a ice cream shaped pool in his backyard and he rejected, as most teens do, his parents' way of life. And so he influenced me to be vegan free. It did not work for me. I had trouble donating to the Red Cross because eventually I had to be vegetarian with some meat, because I'd remember, oh, I got to eat meat before going, even though I think meat's going to cause me cancer. And what else do we hear? Colon cancers and heart problems. Eating meat, it's dangerous. And as a matter of fact, I'll include a clip here where there's a guy who's just extreme. There's people just becoming extreme, trying to force people out of animal protein. But what I tell my kids is, if you're going to go plant-based, you're going to be missing heme iron. You're going to be missing vitamin B12, creatine, carnosine, vitamin D3, and DHA and taurine.
I would
So
say vitamin A. I would add that to the list too.
vitamin A
Yeah.
as well.
Mhm.
So what's very interesting is that when we listen to biochemists from universities, Illinois, Harvard, Stanford, all over the globe, what they're starting to realize is, even if you think you're getting some of these proteins, minerals, and vitamins from the food based on reading the label or looking online for what you're getting, a lot of it is not bioavailable because it's attached to the fibrous parts of the plant. So it's coming out in the bathroom. That's why when people, let's say, for example, eat Brussels sprouts and then they're doubling over or they're having gas, I tell my friends and family now, I don't have gas anymore. I don't have problems with the bathroom. I don't even need toilet paper, really. Of course, I do from time to time, because I'll have a cookie and I'll go off proper way of eating, because sometimes I just want to eat what I want to eat, and that's when I'll notice problems in the bathroom. So if you're having problems with your gut, I tell my kids, you need to look at your food, not assume it's genetic and this is a lifelong struggle and you're going to have to take medications from your doctor. There's a lot that you can do. So I want to ask you about your own family. How have you raised? I know you have a daughter, you have a wife. How have they changed since you've awakened to what's the right way of eating, and what do they eat?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what I try and do with my family is just model good behavior the best I can. And I try, I've learned the hard way that you don't force people to do anything, or if you try, you're gonna, especially with now my daughter's a teenager, to try and force her to do anything, it's gonna be a backlash, right? So in general, that's the approach, just sort of model good behavior. It's been a little bit confusing because when she was born, we were vegetarian. But then when she was about 3, 4 years old, that's when both myself and especially my partner had really bad health issues. She had a kidney stone and a couple of other issues. And that's what led to us introducing first fish and then meat. So yeah, so she eats everything. And she, for a while I tried to sort of give her low carb lunches, but she really wasn't into that. So I give her what I also recommend to some of my clients, I don't call it this with her because if I gave it a name, she wouldn't need it. But we just reduce the amount of refined carbs. So something like the balanced plate that is recommended by I'm forgetting his name. There's a guy called Patrick Holford in the UK. He recommends that you have a plate that's sort of 50% non-starchy vegetables, 25% starchy, like rice or not so much bread, but like starchy grains, and 25% meat. So that's kind of what her plates generally look like. My wife is a little bit more like, she eats a little bit more like me. So, it's mostly meat and then some veg as a low carb veg as like a side dish sometimes, not always. I did a pure carnivore experiment a year ago and ish, yeah. And I thought it was fine. I thought it worked well for me. But I also thought I didn't really need to be that extreme. Um, for me, I mean, my health issues are pretty bad. Like if I start eating starchy carbs more than a couple days in a row, I get all the issues that I used to have. My knees start to ache, my gums start to bleed, I get sort of gassy, like it's not good. So I can't handle the sort of refined carbs at all. But a diet that's like mostly meat with a little bit of low carb veggies on the side, that suits me pretty well. And my wife too.
And I've also taught my kids that people think it's new. First of all, being vegan is fairly new, but they think the carnivore way of eating is fairly new, but it's not. You can find people all over the world who they just don't like their fruits and vegetables. We've heard about them. They eat, meat, or they eat meat and potatoes, and they're doing fine. I'm not saying that, God forbid, you don't go to a cancer ward and they're all vegans or they're all carnivores. There's many reasons for why people get ill. So I'm not saying, exclusively one's better than the other. What I do want to address, especially with my own family and friends, is meat is not the enemy that we were trained in the 80s and 90s. When I went to school,
For
when I went
sure.
to university, we were leaning towards meat is bad, meat's going to cause cancer, and especially butter. You better have margarine and seed oils, which we can talk about in a moment, instead of animal products like the fats. But what I realized too, something that's undeniable, is that there's 20 amino acids and 9 of them are essential. We cannot get them from plants. So that's a pretty good argument that if you want to be vegan, at least eat your fish and your meat from time to time. For example, valine, methionine, histidine, isoleucine, leucine, and lysine. I'm not sure which one of it might be the leucine that really can affect your mental health. So if you have friends or family members or yourself that's struggling with these feelings of doom and anxiety, you can have the excuse that, well, gosh, I'm having financial problems, or I'm struggling with my brother or sister, my neighbors, my work, my children. We all have that. We're all struggling, and sometimes severely. I mean, really, if you look in your Bible, whether you read the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran, you see that life is a struggle, and it's been like this for thousands of years. And if you believe in a higher power, that book is a way of the higher power or the heavenly realm telling you you're going to have challenges, and we don't get away with an easy life. So I feel that if we look especially at the essential amino acids, we really can't live a vegan life for 10 to 30 years and never have fish, never have meat, and be
Yeah.
truly healthy. At least that was my experience. I've shared this before on my show. That's why I started my show. I was having doom and anxiety, and I didn't want to get out of bed. I have 4 children, so I had to get out of bed for them, but I really didn't want to. I was kind of hoping life would end because life was so difficult and I could share my story, but it's the short story that we all have. We all have a struggle. So if you could share a little bit more about that, the amino acids, how your life or your family's life changed based on what you're eating.
Yeah. No, it's pretty heavy. I mean, I think this idea of I mean, there's a couple things to say here. I mean, there's a video on my channel called about meat, menstruation, and mental health. So it's looking at some data basically showing that women and young ladies in particular, young girls in particular who are, my daughter's age who are menstruating, like we actually need to be extra careful with that population. And they probably need to eat more meat than men do because they lose a lot of heme iron, through monthly menstruation, right? And it's looking at some of the papers that show that actually, among vegetarian populations, we do see, in women especially, we do see higher levels of mental health issues. So I think that's something to be really aware of, at least. That's number one. Number two is, when you read on the labels, like especially these labels of like your Beyond Meat or whatever, your fake burgers or tofu or whatever, those labels are really using historical data for how much protein was in these plant foods 20 or 30 or sometimes 50 years ago. I think some of that data is from the 1960s, and extrapolating it to today. And we know that because the soil quality is not good, and we suspect it has something to do with rising CO2 levels as well, there just isn't as much nutrition in those plants as there used to be. So you can look at it, you can do the math, you can do your Excel spreadsheets and all this kind of stuff. You can think you're the most organized vegan in the whole world, and still your numbers may be completely wrong. That's not taking into account the number, the thing that you said earlier, which is bioavailability, right? So if you get your protein from soy or whatever, first of all, you don't get 100% of what you read, but what you read itself may be wrong. Because like I say, there's just less nutrition in the plants than there was when the data on plant nutrition was collected in the 1960s and 70s. So this is stuff to keep in mind. And I think the amazing stuff I've seen, Amalia, is, unlike you, I didn't come to this work for mental health stuff. But one of my first clients, when I was getting my certification, I said, the way the coaching process works is you ask people, okay, what do you want to talk about? And she wanted to talk about her mental health and her relationship with her family. And I sort of like, I didn't say this exactly the way I'm going to say it now, but I was like, okay, I can't really help you with that. So can we talk about diet and the stuff that I'm an expert in? But the thing is, at the end of that process, it was a 12-week process. At the end of that, she said, Sameer, I know you didn't think you could help me with my mental health issues, but my mental health is a lot better. Because once we get the diet right, once we get your brain all the nutrients that it craves, especially all the fat that it craves, that could have been one of the driving factors that was making your depression or anxiety worse than it had to be. And I've seen it again and again and again with clients. It's like we're not really trying to, we improve resilience. When we're talking about, whatever it is, a virus or mental health issues or whatever disease we're talking about, we want to ensure that our body as a host organism for that problem, if you want to think about it that way, is as strong and resilient as it can be. And if you get the diet right, that really does a lot to improve the resilience. I'm not saying it's going to make your mental health issues go away completely, but boy, can it help a lot.
Absolutely. And I'm proof of that. I'm proof of that. All I did, again, I'm not a carnivore. I'm not a vegan or vegetarian. All I did was increase my meats for mental health, mostly red meats, not chicken. And I really can handle life very well. And I notice I'll get a little tinge of anxiety when I don't eat properly. Like the other day, there was Oreo cookies in my car. Someone gave us a sample, these little circles, and I ate them. But I love when I do that because I can see the results and I know what I'm doing. It's horrible. I look at the ingredients and it's just disgusting ingredients, the bad seed oils, which again, we're going to talk about. But I also want to share that when I went to university, I noticed that carbs were the problem, triglycerides were the problem. We really were talking about opposite world because today we say, excuse me, we were saying that fats were the problem, not the carbs. Carbs were healthy. I'm saying the opposite. And now today we're saying, based on studies, fats are actually healthy, protects against stroke. As a matter of fact, the Journal of American College of Cardiology in June of 2020 came out with a meta-analysis, all of these cardiologists, and some of them that advise the government, the dietary guidelines in America. And they said, oops, we were wrong. This is an easy summary. Oops, we were wrong. Saturated fats are good. They protect against stroke, and you should eat more meat and butter and even dairy. I know not everyone's good with dairy, but the experiment that people were doing, I think it was Bob Wolf, is to see if carbs or fat were the problem, and they found out it's not the fat, it's carbs. And a matter of fact, when you eat carbs, I don't think a lot of people know this, you have to get rid of it within 2 hours. Otherwise, it's going to be stored as fat. It's going to cause problems from head to toe. It can affect your eyesight, your hearing, your skin. So it really is, we're starting to learn carbs are the problem. That's why vegan and vegetarians typically, I think the statistics are 80 to 90% stop being vegan within a year. And I know that was me. I lasted a year and that's all I could. But we also learned that fatty acids are not toxic, but glucose is. And we know that disease now is called diabetes. So we know that it's the carbs that's the problem, not the fat. And so when we eat excess carbs, we know that we have to get rid of it. Otherwise, for example, we don't have enough heart fuel. We now know fatty acids are fuel for the heart. So when you're
Yeah.
vegan and you're limiting your cholesterol, and I know Samir is going to talk about this because it's one of his passions, you're really missing out on feeding your heart and feeding your mental health because we need that cholesterol. So can you tell us about that, more about cholesterol and your passion?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things to unpack in what you said. I mean, I think whenever we eat a meal, right, especially a meal that's high in carbohydrates, there's a flood of energy that comes into the body. So let's say in a standard American diet, right, the SAD diet, which I love that acronym. Um, so, or your Oreo cookies, for example, not to pick on you, no judgment
You
for
can
the
pick on
Oreos, by the
me.
way.
I deserve it.
But you have an influx of sugar, and sometimes that's with fat. And what that does is it triggers something called the Randle cycle. The Randle cycle, so as you said, glucose particularly, so all the carbs have to be, well, not the fructose. Fructose is a slightly different pathway. But the carbohydrates, the long chain carbohydrates, say you have a big bowl of pasta with pasta Alfredo, right? So you got some pasta, you got some cream sauce, carbs and fats. That's going to trigger a huge energy spike in the body, and the glucose levels are going to rise. Now, glucose at high levels is toxic in the body. Of course, we need some glucose in the body, lower levels, but at high levels, it's super toxic. And the body is extremely keen to preserve certain kinds of cells over others, right? So you mentioned the heart cells. The heart cells will not accept glucose at this time. The liver cells will not accept glucose. The lung cells will not accept glucose. They will basically turn a mechanism. They'll lock themselves in a room and say, "Oh, no more. I'm not taking any more glucose from you." And what that does is it sacrifices the red blood cells and the endothelial system. So when we're talking about heart disease, this is really the root cause of heart disease. And it's very well understood. Diabetics are, by some measures, 10 times more likely to have a heart attack than non-diabetics, right? And most diabetics die of a heart attack or a stroke, right? So it's very, very well understood that diabetes and heart disease go hand in hand together. Now, okay, so you sacrifice the red blood cells and the endothelial cells. That makes sense because red blood cells have a relatively short lifespan. So that, if you just did this once a year, so if you pigged out on as much pasta Alfredo and Oreos, but only one day a year, your body can totally handle that. The problem is we have access to pasta Alfredo and Oreos, 24/7, 7 days a week. And when you're doing that, then it just becomes too much to handle, and you do develop these, we talked about it a little bit earlier as well, Amalia, that what happens is you get these glycated cells that can also damage, and everything gets glycated, also the LDL. So LDL is not cholesterol. Let's just clarify that terminology wise. Nobody worries about cholesterol. Some people worry about low density lipoproteins, which is LDL, right? And under certain circumstances, frankly, you should be worrying about those LDL particles because if you're eating a lot of sugar, they get glycated. And when they get glycated, like everything else, they become toxic. The red blood cells can become toxic. The LDL can become toxic. Almost anything can become toxic when it is glycated, when you've got too much sugar around. And so that can be part of a process that isn't very well understood, but it causes some scarring internally in the blood vessels. And then other kinds of the cholesterol will come in, brought in by LDL as part of the immune response to basically seal up that wound, to make it like a scab. But unlike a scab, it can't fall off. So it has to be sort of assimilated within the blood vessel. And then eventually, if you're doing that, again, 24/7, 7 days a week, you're going to get layer on layer on layer of sort of scar tissue. And eventually that becomes, first of all, the inner layers of the scar tissue become calcified. And then the new outer layers are so much into the river, right? If you can imagine our circulatory system like a massive, crazy looking river, right? Eventually that becomes like a little, so much into the river that the current of the river sort of pushes it off. And that becomes an island that goes straight to your heart or your brain, and that's a heart attack or a stroke. So we don't want that to happen. So we want to really be careful about the amount of time we let our body be in that state of sort of glucose toxicity, energy toxicity.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the Randall hypothesis, I can't remember his first name, who he set out to prove that carbohydrates were the problem, and then Bob Wolf and other people reversed it, saying, excuse me, I keep saying it wrong, that fat was the problem And now we're realizing it's carbohydrates that are the problem, right? Isn't that what happened with the Rand? Can you explain the Randall hypothesis again?
Yeah,
I'm going to edit
I'm
this.
not. Yeah, I'm not the best at explaining. So there's a couple things to know. I mean, so I think what you're trying to say is that there were a number of scientists. Randall, the guy who came up with this, he himself, I don't think he fully understood it. But there were a number of scientists who were hypothesizing that it's really the glucose that's the problem in the blood when it comes to heart disease. And there's a guy called Ansel Keys who said,
So we just lost power in South Africa, and Samir is going to explain that, and then we're going to get more into vegan versus carnivore and how to help your gut and mental health.
yeah, sorry about that. So we have what's called load shedding here. So we lose power. I think in the US you would call it brownouts. There's just issues with power. It's been going on for a couple of years, to be honest. So that's why I have these backup systems. So that's why my lighting has changed. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So we were talking about the Randall hypotheses, and it's so interesting how we've been so brainwashed through the media, through our public school system, through colleges, that I keep saying it wrong. It used to be that we would blame fat, but now we blame carbohydrate. So I can't even get it out of my mouth properly. I keep even saying what the Randall hypothesis is. It's like opposite world around here. But you know
Yeah,
what I want to talk about, unless you want to talk about it first, is that when the body, so when we're eating carbohydrates and we need to get rid of it within 2 hours, which most of us don't do. We're not working in a farm, we're working in an office, we're working from home, where we live a much more sedentary life. So it has to turn into fat, and our body makes saturated fat. So why is it that all these years that we used to be trained that saturated fat is so bad when it's not? Indeed, we need it. What were you going to say, Samir?
yeah, no, I'm going to say that I really don't have an answer to that question. I mean, the short answer is there's a guy called Ansel Keys who had nutrition science has been a real disaster because, and you can read some really great papers by John Ioannidis and others about bias in nutrition science.
Mm.
And it's a disaster because some of the key players in the field weren't even interested in doing good science. They came with their own bias and they were really trying to prove their bias instead of trying to disprove anything. And I think one of those people, I mean, Ansel Keys knew how to do good science, I suppose, and he was a fish scientist, and he got some interesting experiments done in the Minnesota coronary experiment is one, for example, with conscientious resistors. So we can't trash everything that the guy ever did, but he came with this hypothesis that it's really the saturated fat. And he happened to be advancing this at exactly the same time that President Dwight D. Eisenhower had a heart attack. And Eisenhower smoked, I think, a pack and a half of cigarettes a day. So it's not super surprising that he had a heart attack. But Ansel Keys pushed the line that it's actually, he also would have whatever, steak and eggs for breakfast, maybe. So he pushed the line that it was desaturated fat. And he had a lot of data, not really good data. He had, for example, there's data from Japan. The time that he went to Japan was in the early post-war years of the 1950s. Japan was a very, very poor country that was recovering from from the Second World War. And everyone was living barely at a caloric deficit. And they weren't dying of heart disease because they were dying of other things. I mean, they'd just been, parts of the country had just been suffered nuclear irradiation, So talking about heart disease in that context didn't make much sense. So saying that Japan had low rates of heart disease because they didn't eat much saturated fat, I mean, that's a bit of a stretch, right? And now we know that some of the places that he visited, Okinawa being one, you can go to Okinawa, and if you can get any dish without pork, I mean, good luck to you. It's very difficult. For me as a Muslim, it's very difficult to get any non-porky food in Okinawa, for example, right? So he made all these hypotheses based on how people were eating in the post-war years. Same with Italy, by the way, because a lot of the countries he went to were devastated by World War II. And then he ignored the data that didn't suit his hypothesis. He also went to France. They were eating a lot of saturated fat. They didn't have heart attacks. He ignored that data completely. Or they didn't have as many heart attacks. So it was a bit of cherry picking too. It was really unfortunate, but that became the narrative for a good 40, 50 years, from the 1950s until now, really. I think it's still really the mainstream narrative. I was on a call a little while ago, so one of my clients had asked me, or had asked her doctor if it's okay if I could be on a call with the doctor. And, so I was listening to the device that the doctor was giving, and it was pretty much like, this was someone who had just been given a diagnosis of diabetes, of type 2 diabetes. And it was really bad advice. It was like, limit the saturated fats and so on. So I didn't want to, I didn't step in and correct him. But the point is that the mainstream still is talking as if it's the fat, and it's not.
I think you could speak to this. One of the biggest proofs in my mind is kwashiorkor, kwashiorkor, which is when you see in the developing countries, the small children with the extended belly. And what we've learned is that it's a lack of proteins. So when these children don't have animal proteins, or even in this country, if you're raising your child vegan, when you were pregnant as a vegan, when you're lactating as a vegan, these children have a lifelong lack of muscle cells because that is the developing DNA, which you need animal proteins for. And these children with their distended bellies, they think it's related to that. And it's kind of obvious what they're eating. They're not getting animal proteins, they're impoverished countries. But what's interesting is we're doing the experiment on children in this country. In New York City, they've decided no animal proteins in the schools, which of course, that's the government. And the government also dictates for nursing homes and daycare. So we're doing a human experiment right now, taking out the animal proteins, forgetting about animal proteins help with mental health, gut health, skin issues, your teeth, your eyesight. There's so much we're going to do right now to children. So hopefully they'll get the right nutrients at home and we don't have to depend on the public school. But New York has decided to do that. So that's the litmus test, not only for America, but for the rest of the world. Are you seeing that in South Africa? Are you seeing a push for veganism? And
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, when I first came to this country, it was sort of the last phase of my vegetarianism, and I was kind of upset that I couldn't get, tofu, for example, or this kind of stuff. But now it's here, it's in the stores, and I don't honestly know if it's selling well. Among the people I talk to, it's not doing particularly well. But yeah, it's definitely become a little bit more mainstream than it was even 5, 6 years ago. I think South Africa is also, like behind the curve. So I think, and also there's a big British influence here, and I know that veganism is really big in Britain, or relatively big-ish. So yeah, my sense is it's happening, but you see, it's a very elite thing. Like the middle class folks, people who have money represent a very small percentage of the population here, 10 or 15 or 20% of the most. So 80% of people, for them, protein is really important. And that is going to the farm on the weekend, going to their home on the weekend, and probably killing a chicken and eating that, right? So there still is a population, the majority of the population, who's very connected to their food, and it's mostly animal food. Or the nutritious stuff. They will eat cornmeal, we call it pop in this country. So it's like grits or something like that. They'll eat that, but they know that it's not very nutritious. When they're actually trying to eat nutritious food, they'll eat meat.
You mentioned Professor John Ioannidis. I don't know how to say his name
Yeah,
properly. He's
Ioannidis, yeah.
originated from Greece, and I believe is he out of Stanford or Harvard? I think Stanford.
Stanford, correct.
Stanford. He was instrumental in helping me when the virus first began, in not being fearful, because I've always been aware from family members watching too much TV. They would say to me, "How can you travel? There's avian flu, there's Zika virus, there's Ebola, there's H1N1." And because I was raised with so much fear, I was able to rebel against that. But also that Professor John Ioannidis, can't say his name properly, he helped me because he was able to use statistics and data. Like you said, he's very educated, and he's educated the world. I think he's one of the most published professors possibly on the globe. He's really up there.
He's extremely prolific, and I think the way he's referred to sometimes as the most cited currently living sort of university professor. So he's not only he's written a lot of papers, but he's written a lot of very influential papers.
He helped me because I started sharing this phrase that fear shuts down the critical thinking parts of the brain. So I realized my family and friends who are watching a lot of TV, the fear helped guide their behaviors. And I really tried to fight against that. Because as we know, in the last 2, 3 years, there was a lot of fear. And I just wanted to be able to listen to people like him, listen to people like you, and educate myself versus the television that's just slamming us with so much fear. And they're doing it now with veganism or plant-based. And something I recently realized is a lot of people who are struggling, who are vegans, they're usually having gut issues or having skin issues, and sometimes it's mental health issues, or even like Dr. Terry Walls, I always mention her. She had multiple sclerosis that was impossible to get rid of. She got rid of it. She was a healthy, plant-based vegan. She has to eat, she has grass-fed beef every day. She has liver once a week, but she still does use some certain plants, but they're very particular.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. Funny that you mentioned her. I do. So my dad, as I mentioned, has a very rare autoimmune disorder, and he did try the Walls protocol. It's a lot of vegetables. It's
Mm,
like nine cups of vegetables a day,
mhm.
which is kind of insane. And into three categories, I think sulfur containing and leafy greens, and then bright vegetables. It worked for her. Hey, more power to her. But to be honest, even if you look in the cohort in the studies that she's helped published, and you look at her cohort, no one else has gotten to like 100% remission or close to 100% remission like she has. And I think
Oh.
she herself has changed her approach. I think she's using more meat and more fasting since she developed that book. So it's an interesting case study. I mean, I think that my preference for autoimmune stuff and the way that I'm doing it now as well is just a mostly carnivore approach. That seems to be because most of the triggers are plant foods, and it's really hard to do elimination diets properly, like a low FODMAP diet or whatever it is, the Whole30 or whatever approach you want to do. I'm not saying that those don't work. They can be useful, but why not just do a carnivore elimination diet, and I think that'll be more successful for a lot of people.
That makes a lot of sense. In the last few months, she was interviewed. I forgot on what show, but I'll include a clip. And yep, she starts rejecting the cholesterol hypotheses, which I forgot. I still want you to ask. She's now, yeah, definitely much more meat-based, less plant-based. And you mentioned FODMAP, so I just want to let everyone know that's fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, which are basically sugar. That's the acronym for FODMAP, FODMAP. People use that because when they're having gut and other issues, they'll start to do plant eliminations. So there's charts to see which is high in FODMAPs. Well, how about just start eating more meat and less FODMAPs, which are in vegetables? That's why, again, I mention, especially the cruciferous, when people have cauliflower, broccoli, especially Brussels sprouts, their gut is talking to them. When you're doubled over and grabbing your gut, but at the same time thinking, wow, plants are so great. Well, maybe plants are the problem. We give plants such a pass, and we demonize meat. However, what we're learning, Samir and I have been learning for many years now, is that maybe meat is really not that bad.
No, I mean, I would go a step further and say,
Mm.
if I hadn't introduced if I hadn't shifted to a meat-based diet, I'd still be suffering from a lot of the problems that I was suffering with before. And so meat is very healing. And not just meat, animal foods in general. Like I've started including raw eggs into my diet, and I don't know, it's working really well for me. So I don't think it works well for everyone. I know some people have reactions to egg whites. But doing a good number of 6 to 10 raw eggs a day has really helped my digestion. It's reduced my autoimmune symptoms. I also have vitiligo, so it's like a skin pigmentation disease. I
Oh
don't think you
yeah.
can even see it anymore.
Supposedly Michael
But
Jackson had it.
correct. But doing a good number of 6 to 10 raw eggs a day has really helped my digestion. It's reduced my autoimmune symptoms. I also have vitiligo, so it's like a skin pigmentation disease. I
Oh
don't think you
yeah.
can even see it anymore.
Supposedly Michael
But
Jackson had it.
correct. So this wrist, the light's not great either, but this wrist used to look like I was wearing a watch when I wasn't wearing a watch. But now it's gotten like, I think if the light was a little better, I might be able to show it to you. But you have to really strain to see, oh yeah, I see there's a little pink
You're
spot there or
saying that
something.
based on your eating, your vitiligo is reducing?
Yes. I have a couple of videos
Wow.
about this. So, what I did, the only time I saw it reduce in the past, so up until like 3 months ago, was when I did that pure carnivore experiment, like about a year ago. So when I was vegan, it wasn't growing, but it wasn't really shrinking either. It was just there, and it was when I was vegan, I was also young. I was in my 20s, right? So I think it's a different story. Lately, with the stress of life and so on, and having kids and so on, it was really growing, and I started to get worried because you don't really like it on your face and so on for cosmetic reasons. So I started to get worried about it. And I did the carnivore experiment, and there was a little tiny spot on my face that went away when I went carnivore. But just in the last couple of months with the raw eggs, it seems to be even better without me even trying really much. So it seems to be going away completely now, which is great.
So you're saying you crack an egg and you'll eat it raw, you don't cook it? Is that what you're saying might be helping?
I'm not quite at that level. My partner did that the other day, and I was very impressed. I'm not quite at that level. What I'll do is I'll take 6 eggs and a bit of heavy cream and some ice. It's hot here. It's getting to be summertime, and I'll make a kind of very eggy milkshake, maybe with some vanilla flavored stevia or maybe some strawberries. Or today I put like a little shot of coffee in it. So it's just 6 raw eggs in a milkshake basically, and I've been doing that once a day at least for a couple of months, and it really seems to be improving both my gut health and my autoimmune symptoms.
Well, putting it all together, Samir, listening to Dr. Terry Walls, listening to the people on my show that save their own life, for the most part, they adopted a more meat-based diet, a more butter, organs like liver, and their autoimmune issues started to melt away. That includes you, vitiligo. I didn't know that. I'm so excited because I'm going to refer a client to you. I have a friend whose husband has vitiligo, and I notice sometimes in homes there'll be seed oils, there'll be canola, grape seed, cottonseed. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it's been marketed to us as vegetable oil. And I ask my friends when I see it in their closets, sometimes I don't say anything in their pantries because I'm uncomfortable going into someone's home
Sure.
and then saying, look what's in your pantry. But anyone I'm good friends with, I'll say, look at that canola oil, that cottonseed, the grape seed. Do you know what it is? It's seeds. It's not vegetables. And look up how it's processed. It is not healthy. There's chemicals. I can't even memorize the names that help extract the oil from the seeds. And so because of the wars, World War I and World War II, when we no longer had wars, they had to sell it to us. So they sold it because it was being used in machinery. So then we started eating it as margarine. We started cooking with it. It's in baked goods.
Yeah.
It's in most foods, especially for vegans, unfortunately. If they're not just eating the plants and they're eating something plant-based that's made in a restaurant or made in a box or a bag, they're getting those seed oils. But what I want to say is basically when we're eating the way you used to eat, which may have advanced or started your vitiligo, it really has to do with our muscle cells because a lot of us don't think about it. But what are the two functions of muscle? It's for mobility and metabolism. Right. As we age, people start to have aches and pains, and usually it's because they've been trained that that protein is bad. They'll eat less and less of it. They'll have more of the rice, the lentils, the pasta, salads. And for some of us, it could be because of the FODMAPs, it's hurting us mentally and physically. And so muscle has everything to do with our metabolism. And so when we're eating more of the FODMAPs, more of the vegetables, we're increasing our insulin. And a lot of people are starting to get glucose monitors to check themselves. And it often leads to insulin resistance the way they're eating, which leads to diabetes. So we used to blame fat for all our problems, but really we're now starting to think based on really biochemists and many of the major schools that this is not true, that when we eat a carb, we have to get rid of it really fast. When we eat fat, it's feeding our heart, and fat lasts in the body a lot more for energy. Do you have any comments about that, about you personally? Or
Yeah. I mean, I don't know where you want me to go with that, but can I say something about the seed oils and the origin? So you mentioned one point of origin, which is the wars, but there's an earlier point of origin, which is electricity. So in the 19th century, you had these electric streetlights that came in the US. And what was there before the electric streetlights? Well, before that was whale oil lights. Whale oil lights became expensive, and basically the whales got hunted almost to extinction. And that was replaced with cottonseed oil. Now, cottonseed oil was this is to burn lamps at night, right? Cottonseed oil was super important for the US. Think about the US economy in the 19th century. It was a cotton-based economy. And so finally, you could use those waste products, which were the cotton seeds, you could turn that into cottonseed oil and you could burn it. Now, when electricity came in, that was a big problem for the US government and for cotton producers. And what they wanted to do was to find a way to be able to make that edible. And so it was really marketed as vegetable lard and by the year 1900, exports of butter were banned from the US to Europe, were banned because they were all adulterated with this cottonseed oil. So, it has an even more pernicious history than the one that you're mentioning, which is that it used to be used just as extra energy to burn. And when that no longer worked, they figured out a way to sell it to people as food, but it was never intended to be food.
In my last interview, someone asked in the comments about gorillas and other animals. Will say, "Well, why is it gorillas, which seem so similar to us, they can live being vegan? So
Yeah.
why the larger animals are doing that, and why can't we?"
So gorillas are interesting, right? If you look at a gorilla, I'm here in Africa, not that we have gorillas in South Africa, but they're in Uganda, not too far away from where I am right now. And if you look at it, it's got a massive belly, and that massive belly has a massive lower intestine. We have a relatively small lower intestine, and that's a place where gorillas can ferment plant foods. So herbivores, because plants have their own defense chemicals and because plants are not easy to digest, herbivores have a big digestive system, and they have a place for those plant foods to ferment. And that's, we talked a little bit about ruminants the last time, but with the great apes, that's also the case, that they just have space for that those vegetables to ferment. It's also not the case that gorillas are purely vegetarian, by the way, because when they eat the fruits, there's bugs in the fruits. They'll also eat ants and stuff. We know that some species of monkey, like chimpanzees, will hunt smaller monkeys.
Oh,
So, we're talking about animals that had a common ancestor with us. So the ancestor of gorillas, if you go back and back and back and back, they had a common ancestor with us maybe 8 or 10 million years ago. And we've been human, we've been on our own line for at least 4 million years. So, and Homo sapien developed over 2 million years. So it's not really that close. Like, we're not very close to them. So comparing us to gorillas is not very useful.
also, I know that their gut system is different. We have a different length of, let's say, the colon, cecum, small intestine, large intestine. So
100%.
we're
Yeah.
just built different on the inside.
And
So I want to ask.
the other thing I'll say about that is that if you look at the brain size, so if you have a non-human primate with human features, you know that that creature will have a much smaller brain. So something happened which allowed us to develop the bigger brains. And most of us anthropologists think that it was the addition of meat to the diet, especially fatty meat, which allowed us to develop the bigger brains. Otherwise, if you look at any other primate with our dimensions, it should have a much bigger gut and a much smaller brain.
So the biggest question I think most of us have being vegan or carnivore are vegans more ethical because they use less land? They're not part of killing animals. Is it just more ethical to be vegan despite all the health issues? Some of us are just going to say, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with killing animals, and it doesn't matter what it does to my health. It's more ethical.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, listen, again, I'm not going to tell people how to eat. You eat how you want to eat. But if ethics is your thing, or if, let's take one of the issues you raised, land use. 2/3 of the land on the planet can, 2/3 of arable land on the planet, or 2/3 of land that can be used to grow food, cannot be used to grow crops, right? So you have a choice. Either you raise animals on that land or you don't use it for food production. And with 8 billion people on the planet, I don't think we have the luxury of not using that for food production, right? So this is just, every vegan argument fails when you look at these kind of basic things. I think there's ethical and there's non-ethical foods. I think I can agree on that. But the non-ethical stuff is stuff that's related to, for example, the cottonseed industry that we talked about. It's these industrial processes that are, coming out of these weird systems, industrial agricultural systems, that are destroying the planet. There's no question about it. And some of those include animal farming. Like, for example, pig farming in parts of the US is very, it doesn't look good. It's very polluting. It's not very good for the pigs. It's not very good for anyone. So if we can move to more traditional farming methods, if we can move to regenerative farming methods, then that's going to be a lot more ethical from my point of view. But pretty much, if I meet someone, so my daughter, for example, has a friend who's vegan and has friends who are vegetarian. If I meet them, I'll ask them, okay, what is it, what is it that's driving you to do this? And at the end, any rational argument, I think, is going to fall apart if they have a discussion with me. And what people are left with is it's a religious belief. And if it's a religious belief, that's fine. There's nothing I can do about it. There's all kinds of religions in the world. If your religion is veganism, that's great. You should just acknowledge that that's what it is, though. It's not really something based on any rational understanding of how we can move to a more sustainable food system.
You know, you're reminding me what you just talked about is there's a hospital that a lot of professors and doctors are talk about. It's in Hungary, and I haven't heard of any in America that have begun. I don't know if you have any in South Africa, but they're helping people get rid of their diabetes, their Crohn's. I can't remember other diseases, but they're using fats, organs, and meat. I don't even think they're using supplements. Dr. Danneberg was the first to tell me about this hospital in Hungary that's really just a miraculous place. They're helping people, I think, even with glioblastoma multiforme, the dangerous brain cancer. And I think a lot of people should look into that. What are they doing there, and maybe emulate that when you're having gut issues, when you're having, mental issues. But I also wanted to get a little bit more experience with your travels around the world. One is sun. I believe I read this in your book, the benefits of sun. And a lot of us are afraid, including myself. My sister had eye cancer when she was 21. Now she's close to 50. So I covered my children completely in these long bathing suits and sun protection and sun hats. And so who knows if quite a few years of their life they were missing the proper vitamins that come from the sun. But most of us are afraid of sun. We think it's going to give us skin cancer. And yet I've been hearing from a lot of carnivores, stepping into the sun has changed for them. It seems like the more nutrients, the more amino acids they're getting, they're not quite having the sunburns and the problems with the sun. Was this in your book? And what can you share with us about the farmers you've met and sun in general?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's when we go to places like Tibet or Nepal that are at high elevation and where people are spending all day in the sun and it's very bright sunshine. Sometimes it's too cold to really for clouds to form in some of the places I'm talking about. What you'll see with the older people is actually their skin. It looks healthy, but it does have a certain kind of aged look around to it as well. So I think that's just part of. I mean, their diet also includes a lot of carbs, so maybe that's not the
Mm.
best population to extrapolate from. But they don't get skin cancers. Is where I was
Hmm.
going with that. Even though they probably get more sun exposure than any other population on the planet. There is some data that it's mostly anecdotes, I have to say. I don't know that I've seen good data about this, which shows that when we take the omega-6 seed oils out of the diet, people who used to get sunburn just don't do that anymore. Um, and when we replace it with ghee and other animal fats, over time, skin is not something that you can fix in a week. It takes a couple of months at least. But over 3 to 6 months, we can really see a difference in the ability, the health of the skin. And then, yes, you're 100% right. So vitamin D synthesis, the sun needs to be at a certain angle. So when you're in the winter in sort of northern latitudes, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get the right kind of sun exposure. And so, when I'm talking to people in Canada, for example, I mean, we do have to talk about supplementation. But in the summertime, you can definitely get the vitamin D you need from the sun. If you go out there and spend not really that much time, 30 minutes to an hour. And also there's other chemicals as well. Nitric oxide is something that is very good for our blood vessels. By the way, this is one reason that most heart attacks happen in the wintertime is because we're not producing vitamin D, we're not producing
Mm.
nitric oxide enough, we're not in the sun enough. And so you're more likely to have a heart attack in the wintertime than in the summertime. So yeah, sun is important too.
That's incredible. I didn't know that about wintertime and heart attacks. That's great. That's why I think y'all should read Sameer's book. There's so much really good information in there. And ever since I reversed how I think, and like I said, I was covering up my children throughout their early years. Now I tell them you got to get outside, find a backyard because one of my sons is living in the city. It's kind of tough, but take off your shirt, go in your underwear, get private and get 15, 20 minutes of sun. You need that for your mental health. You need that for your vitamin. I think it's D3, maybe even DHA. There's so many benefits that you get. It comes through your eyes, it comes through your skin. So now I've taught my kids. So I guess it has to do with anything in moderation. But as you're saying, the farmers you meet who are in the sun most of the day, they're not getting skin cancers. But I love hearing that it could be related to the seed oils. And I really hope a lot of my friends are listening to this because I still see friends in their cabinets are these fake seed oils that say vegetable oil on it.
And it was marketed as the healthy alternatives, right? I mean, we were told to take the butter out and to use Crisco and so on. And I think we all sort of went along with that. So I think we have to unlearn. There's a lot we have to unlearn.
Yeah, we all have a lot to unlearn. And one of the things I've been telling my older friends and family is, hey, I think you need to eat much more meat and fat because, they're going to the local, famous coffee houses. They usually have a wrap. That's the tortilla. Whatever's in the coffee is sugar. or they're having a lot of alcohol. A lot of my friends and family have a lot of alcohol. And I say, you might want to reduce the sugar, because as your family gets in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, some of them, you see, they get a little bit of confusion. And I really think it's related to these sugars. Their insulin, their glucose levels are just up and down and all over the place all day long. And perhaps it's leading to problems with their brain. So I want to ask you about that, Alzheimer's. What do you recommend for brain health? And are these medications working that people are using for Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I mean, the one, so I think we discussed this the last time we had a chat, Amalia. So no, the standard medications don't really work so well, is the short answer. The one medication that has been shown to have a pretty decent effect sometimes is glucophage, what's it called? Metformin. Metformin, which is a blood sugar regulator. And so we talked about how Alzheimer's can be seen as sort of diabetes of the brain or type 3 diabetes. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is, and there are some chemicals, like, for example, berberine, that may have a similar effect. Turmeric is also thought to have some kind of a good effect when it comes to Alzheimer's in particular. But in general, if you lower, these diseases are all known to be associated with inflammation. So if you lower the foods that cause inflammation, if you lower the quantity of those foods that you're taking, mostly we're talking about sugars, you mentioned alcohol, carbohydrates in general, you reduce that and you increase the foods that are more healing and nourishing, which are, in my view, the animal-based, protein-based foods, you're doing what you can. Is it a guarantee that you won't get Alzheimer's or dementia? Of course not. In life, there is no guarantee. But what we can do is reduce our risks. And I think that's one way to do it.
And we used to think that reducing your risk meant reducing cholesterol. Cholesterol is the enemy. Now we know it helps us with estrogen, testosterone, converting vitamin K1 to K2. A lot of it has to do with getting sun exposure, which helps us develop our cholesterol. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Is cholesterol the enemy? And do we need to probably go on a statin if our LDL is too high, HDL is too low?
Yeah, I mean, let's leave the statins out of it for now, because I think it's that end. Statins are known to reduce risk in populations that already have had a heart attack. So for secondary prevention, and it has nothing to do with cholesterol, it's because statins increase the production of nitric oxide, which we discussed earlier, right? So it loosens the blood vessels a little bit, but it's also has other issues. So for someone who hasn't had a heart attack, it's not something I can even, I wouldn't go there. There's other things you can do to increase nitric oxide production, number one. But when we talk about cholesterol, as you say, it is a molecule that is a precursor to a lot of vitamins, to all the sex hormones, so your estrogen, your testosterone, progesterone, etc. Cortisol as well. And as you mentioned, we convert cholesterol to vitamin D through sunlight. So it's super important. And it's not something that we want to, I mean, I've heard some doctors who I otherwise respect a lot talking about the need to reduce cholesterol to really, really low levels, like 20, 30. My cholesterol is at least 200, I think. So they're talking about, it should go to 10% of what mine is, for example. And I think that's really irresponsible. I think that can lead to a lot of problems because it is needed. Now, there's another question about dietary cholesterol, and what the government has said, what the US government has said as of 2018, I believe, is that dietary cholesterol is not related to the blood level cholesterol, which is totally true. It's too big a molecule to be digested, so it's just not relevant. Some of it, it's not clear how much, but maybe 20% of the cholesterol that you eat can end up in the bloodstream through a process called re-esterification, but it's not super significant. So I would say, even the US government says eat your cholesterol, but it's not related to the cholesterol that ends up in the blood. And as we mentioned, it's not cholesterol that anyone is concerned with. If you go to the doctor, they'll talk about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. I would say change your doctor if he or she talks about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, because there's no such thing, just cholesterol. It's one simple molecule. We have different. Cholesterol is a lipid. It's hydrophobic. It doesn't dissolve in water. So the different molecules that take it around the bloodstream, because it's super important. One of those is high density lipoprotein, and one of those is low density lipoprotein. There are others as well, chylomicrons and IDL, intermediate density lipoproteins. Don't need to worry about the details. I think the point is, as long as you're eating real human food, as long as you're eating like a human should eat, you're really not going to have an issue. The body will make the cholesterol that you need. And I don't think there's much more to say than that. I mean, worry about your blood sugar levels as a primary marker. Worry about HDL. If you have low HDL, that can be associated with heart disease as well. Worry about your triglycerides. Those indicators are super important. And if they're under control and your LDL looks high and worries your doctor, I would say go and get an actual scan. Go and get a CAC done, a coronary artery calcium scan done. In some places in the US, they're only like $100, although I don't think insurance covers them. So go and get your scan and then show it to your doctor and say, my cholesterol is 300 or whatever it is, or my LDL level is whatever it is. But I have a 0 coronary artery calcium score. So, can I get your commitment to stop bugging me about this for now? Because frankly, the doctors are really not helping us on this.
My vegan friend just privately explained to me he's 99% vegan. Once in a while he'll have fish, hasn't had red meat since the 80s, that he did his CAC and he has a 50% blockage somewhere, I think in the neck. I can't remember where. So he's concerned he is going to do a carnivore experiment to see if somehow that'll change his what's going on in his blood vessel system. But it just goes to show that just because we're vegan or vegetarian doesn't mean we get away scot-free and we're just so perfectly healthy.
No, for sure.
We really can have issues sometimes. But, a lot of the vegans depended on, I mean, for me, it was the John Robbins book. He really strongly influenced me. Like I said, the 31 Flavors Empire. But a lot of people talk about the Adventist study. I think it's at a Loma Linda University. Loma Linda is a place in California where they say, hey, this religious sect, this group, they're vegetarian and they live 7 years longer. And that's why I'm vegan, or that supports their vegan theory. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I do. But if you don't mind, let's go back to your vegan friend. So what I just recommend that he or she do is check out, there's a doctor called Dr. William Davis, I think it is, the guy who, he loves L. rhodoroi, the sort of Lactobacillus rhodoroi is a kind of probiotic that he really believes in, and he makes yogurt out of it. He has a whole protocol for reducing your CAC score, which I thought was pretty good. It includes vitamin K2. Vitamin K2 supplementation is probably going to be pretty important for that person. So just something to think about. And then the Loma Linda study. So if we look at Adventists, it is true, probably, I have to look at that data. First of all, let's look at how vegetarians are defined in that study. I think a vegetarian is defined as someone who eats meat less than once or once a week or less, something like that. And a vegan is defined as someone who eats meat once a month or less, or once every 2 weeks or less. I've got this wrong somehow, but the point is it's not excluding meat altogether, number one. So they have some definitional issues. Number two is if you compare any religious community with the general population, they're going to live longer, because we know that community is one of the things that can lead to health and longevity, right? And I mentioned this last time with the Okinawa, with the 3 people who are sort of grow up together and give each other presents, and they form their own community and so on. That's a really good example of how that works in a non-religious kind of way, although it may be tied to religion. I'm not sure. But if we compare the Adventists to Mormons who do eat meat, but otherwise are quite similar, they don't drink, they don't smoke, etc., you find that there is no longevity benefit between those 2 communities. So the Loma Linda stuff is actually, it's extremely weak. But it's also extremely influential because those people have actually infiltrated not just the Loma Linda study, but they have, they're all over. I mean, they really try and control food guidelines in many countries. I just did an interview with Dr. Gary Fetke, who talked about how the Adventists have really shaped the processed food industry and the nutritional guidelines in Australia for the last 20 or 30 years. So it's, the influence that those folks have in this space is they're really punching above their weight. They have a lot of influence because I think they were so committed to this at a time when most of us didn't really care. They were here early. The rest of us are playing catch up, unfortunately, because I think the way that they look, again, they have an ideology. They're not shy about their ideology. They want everyone to eat the Garden of Eden diet of nuts and fruits, nuts and seeds, and they believe that when everyone does that, Jesus will come back and it'll be the end of the world or something. I don't quite understand. So They have their own religious, not to make fun of their religious ideology, that everyone is, freedom of religion is something that we believe in totally. But that shouldn't be what's dictating, our dietary guidelines or our lives, right?
I think a good litmus test to relying on the Adventist study, the what's it called?
Loma Linda.
Loma Vista, I think it is. Loma
Okay.
Linda
Yeah.
is look around at your own family. If your mental health is great, if your gut health is great, your skin, your teeth, your joints, your anxiety is under control and depression, then fine, continue what you're doing. But if not, your body is talking to you. And a good example would be the Mormons. So the Mormons, compared to the Adventists, the Mormons also live an average of 7 years longer than people in their area. However, they do eat meat. And so it comes back to what Sameer said. It's all about community. If the more isolated you are, the more lonely you are, your health will suffer, your mental health, your physical health. It's all about taking care of our elders, going to any group, whether it's your church, your mosque, your shul, your temple, just being part of a community, which especially after this virus, a lot of people withdrew tremendously and their mental health suffered. But I do think what Sameer said makes sense, that just look more into that study and even see that these were not pure vegans. They did eat meat, they did eat fish, they were not vegans. And the last thing I want to talk about, but then go into whatever you want to, Sameer, is fasting. What do you think about fasting? Are there benefits? Is it good? Can it be too extreme?
No, I think, listen, in general, if someone comes to me, there are a number of levels we can push. So sometimes, especially I find this with men, they come to me expecting like an exercise regimen. And for most people, that's not where you start, man. It's a really, really bad place to start. So for most people, we have a choice. We can change what you eat. So we can talk about the dietary stuff. We can move you towards whatever it may be, carnivore, low carb, keto, whatever your preference is. I'm not super dogmatic. Whatever direction you want to go in, we'll get you there. But I'm going to help you find an effective direction. So if you say you want to be vegetarian or vegan, I'm probably going to try and dissuade you from that direction. At least we have to talk about carbs, right? Or we can change when you eat. So when you eat is the two modalities of that. One is TRF, so time restricted feeding. So this is, if you eat within a certain window every day, so an 8-hour window, many people eat between say 12 p.m. and 8 p.m. So that's 16/8 fasting or 16/8 TRF, time restricted feeding. That's fine, and that's definitely some of that we do with everyone. And then for some people, we'll also talk about extended fasting. So one of the first people who I didn't treat him, I'm not a doctor, but I worked with him for his long COVID symptoms, and I was able to help him cure himself when the doctors couldn't. One of the things that we did was, he ate one meal every second day. And he was feeling good, within 5 days of doing that. So for many people, it's a very, very, very effective modality. I think there comes a time, like when you're quite healthy, there comes a time when the extended fasting especially doesn't serve much of a purpose. And there's other people I deal with, especially the ex-vegans who are underweight. And so they ask me about fasting, and I'm like, yeah, let's not go there right away. Let's talk about something else, please. So it depends on the individual, but for a lot of people, it can be very effective.
So for people who want to reach out to you, Sameer, how can they do that? And I'll put everything in the description. You could also put it in the comments, and I will as well.
Yeah, so at least for the next couple of weeks, I'm offering a free consultation. So I can put the link there in the comments below. So this is just a half-hour session to, help you understand your own health issues and how you want to approach them. And then, I have a website, I have a YouTube channel. I'd love to see people engage there. Like I say, I have some really cool interviews.